I think that's how he connected his conservatism, was not only what we know from the past, but what's the best idea for today and what will benefit future generations.
Economics puts constraints on your utopias, and I absolutely believe that Buckley understood that it's not about getting perfect. It's about getting the best that we can have so that we can get the most out of life. We need to live in a society where the economic system fosters entrepreneurship, the unleashing of human capital for the betterment of all of us. I think economic freedom was absolutely essential to the legacy of Bill Buckley, both intellectually, what he believed was true, but also his just ardent support of it in public. So kind of in his writings, but also in firing line and things like this. So for Buckley, I think economic freedom was the core of what protected individual liberty. And if you lose economic freedom, then you lose political freedom and you lose the fabric of Western civilization. I think he would take it that far.
I loved how he started with first principles. There was always the umbrella of freedom, but it was economic freedom that undergirded everything that he spoke about. And we see that today in the innovations of tomorrow. It's what makes the nation so vibrant and prosperous. This creation of wealth spawns from that idea.
I agree, and I think that he saw the dangers of the erosion of economic freedom. So if we start to lose those institutions of free enterprise and free people and commerce, then we open ourselves to not just collectivism, which of course he was very worried about, but authoritarianism. So he kind of, I think, really understood the consequences of not getting economic freedom right as a matter of American policy and American institutions.
And Buckley always started from first principles. You always had the umbrella of freedom. And of course, economic freedom falls under that. That's the ability to create. I mean, when we talk about the pursuit of happiness or the American dream, that's economic freedom for so many people in our country, and so many people benefit from it. We're able to lift our people out of poverty because of it and remain a force around the globe because of it.
That's right, and I think that's why this conversation that he understood so long ago when he started thinking and writing about it is essential to today and today's policies. And it is that return to first principles. And what does it mean to be a conservative? What does it mean to understand and believe in economic freedom? And so if the principles are always true because they're principles, which he of course believed, then they're timeless. And so I think kind of really trying to help new generations understand what he was fighting for and the context in which he was fighting for it is really important.
We could really learn a lesson from Bill as well, how he brought on other proponents of what he believed in, but how he also engaged with adversaries, with a civil dialogue.
Yes.
And he was persuading the adversary, but more so the audience, in bringing these ideas to life or exposing the flaws on the other side.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I think we see less and less of that today, and that's a problem. We tend to be isolated in our echo chambers where we kind of get affirmation of what we, kind of think we already believe. And I think he said, no, that's not the way to do this. And of course, he was, when he started, writing, he was at a time when conservatives didn't really have a movement the way they do today. So I think that's, so important for both then and now.
Absolutely. And this idea of being in the business of persuading, of putting out what you believe, exposing it to the counter argument, and then overcoming it. Today there's, and hopefully not into the future, but it seems to be these echo chambers or camps, rather this discourse where you're tuning in. I know for me, I watch and think, I agree with him. I think that makes more sense. And that's very much how you develop a political philosophy.
That's right. Persuasion means you have to entertain the other points of view, and you have to give them a space for argumentation. I think he, in that way, what he was trying to do was incredibly scholarly, even though he wouldn't say he was a scholar per se. He wasn't an academic, but what he was doing was deeply intellectual, and he was opening up kind of ex-communists, right? Were writing with him in the early days of National Review, and I think he thought that was very important because they understood the other side in a deep way, Whereas maybe somebody who called themselves a conservative or leaned Republican or kind of like the free market or something like this didn't deeply understand evaluating both of these types of economic systems against one another. And so I think that was brilliance on his part, and we need more of that today.
Yes, and many of the ex-communists or socialists became his most powerful presenters on what they had seen and might sound good theoretically, but actually didn't work in practice with human beings.
That's right, exactly. So for him, it was always about returning us to the human condition. And I think that's why he very much understood that economic freedom was the only way.
Part of the truth that I think Bill Buckley talked about that were timeless were this idea of conservatism and what are we conserving? And the ideas around our Declaration and Constitution and the things presented in the Federalist Papers were the right path. And you can have no aspirations higher than life and liberty, and that we're all created equal. And Bill seemed to, with his great use of vocabulary, always be able to educate around that, but come solidly back to what the point was. And you could find it in our founding documents. And I think in many ways, that's where we should have more of our debate from.
Agree. I think he also put a strong emphasis on human dignity, which gets into everything that you just said. So for him, he was just an absolute, unwavering, deeply committed Christian. And I think for him, this is the source of the fight for freedom. He believes that human beings are made in the image of God. He believes that human beings have inherent dignity and that the government actually can protect that dignity or it can erode it in very dangerous ways. And so for him, I think that's a principle that he inspired him over quite a long career and really looking at the political trends over his lifetime. I mean, he could have easily given up many times, as right, all of us want to sometimes, but I think he was so deeply faithful and so deeply committed to the ideas of private property rights. And where does that come from? That comes from believing and understanding that people have not only dignity, but we have responsibilities to each other socially. So he viewed that the market economy is a way for us to mitigate kind of our self-interest in some ways, but also kind of engage in this society where we can serve one another. I mean, I always talk about it as serving strangers, right? And I think he really believed that fell out of the market economy, but that's just a timeless principle for him.
And that really came from Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. You know, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker are doing this in what's in their self-interest, but yet they benefit the community and society as a whole. We like to say in Arizona that Barry Goldwater never lost that election. In 1964, it just took 16 years to count the votes. And in so many ways, that was Bill Buckley's conservatism of limited government, free market economics, and America that leads around the globe come to life. The other difference that I see with the foundational concept of Bill Buckley is, yes, he wanted a limited government, and in many ways a smaller federal government, but he thought there was a role for government and the individual and the private sector, along with the religious community. I mean, this is how we solve so many of our issues and really be the good society that we aspire to become.
Agreed. I think what was powerful about the movement that he was cultivating, but also just his ideas and the way he thought about the world, is that he wanted to bring together libertarians and conservatives. And this is this idea of ordered liberty, which I kind of think is part of what you're saying. There's a role for the state, there's a role for the market, and there's a role and an importance of a robust civil society. And so he understood the power of all three. I think he also understood, as we've talked about a little bit before, that the government is necessary, but it also can encroach upon those other sectors in very devastating ways. And so, this idea of how do we create a society of ordered liberty where the government allows us to flourish as much as we can as different people, as you say, pursuing our own self-interest, going back to Adam Smith, which of course, that's his legacy is that the market through private property rights is the way that we mitigate greed. It's not that the market can transform us. nor can the government transform our human nature, but they can kind of play on our passions and actually get us to think about the common good. And I think he was very committed to a balanced society that allowed for the most human flourishing. So for him, certainly it wasn't about abolishing the government, but it was about, as we say, keeping it in its lane. How do we do that? How do we use it for its best purposes and limit the tendency toward what he would talk about as statism or collectivism, which he was rightly very worried about.
And he was so good at this idea of bringing people together and this fusionism that did turn into a majority movement in so many ways. And this idea of understanding that human beings do act on incentives. And this is why he leaned into supply side economics, because give people the incentive to create, to innovate, to go into the market with their idea. And then if they have wild success, it should be applauded. For me, I really have a special place for Milton Friedman. We passed a law in Arizona, the American Civics Act, so that every student has to pass the same citizenship test that a new naturalized citizen passes, because there was such a lack of understanding and really fundamental things. But I think Milton Friedman in the Free to Choose series, it's available free on YouTube in 10 episodes, does such a good job of clearly communicating what economic freedom looks like. And he doesn't just talk about it in the economy or global trade. It's really where the idea of school choice came from. We want our kids to be the best educated kids in the country, yet we have so many people trapped in failing public schools. And it was Friedman who said we can innovate out of this with the school choice and the idea that you can take your taxpayer dollars and go to a place that's right for your child. And we're starting to see that sweep the country right now. We should see a real renewal of American education, and we shouldn't accept this substandard education that happens in so many parts of our country.
And certainly when he ran for mayor of New York, he talked about that. I think Milton Friedman was a very close friend and an intellectual kind of, I was going to say intellectual mentor, which I think is true, but I also think they played off each other and they talked about these ideas. And what an amazing world to live in, to be friends with Milton Friedman. I mean, I'm jealous of that. It's amazing. And so, I think if you look at the policies that he advocated and the way that he thought, as you just said with education, his concern was, and same with Milton Friedman, was that the government was encroaching on the ability of education to be catered to individuals. This is important to his view of the world, that there are not generic individuals. Government programs can only cater to generic people. And so the problem is they fail a lot. And I think one of the kind of brilliant aspects of, again, back to the principles that he advocated, was let's get the support that we need to be as local as possible. So let's get the federal government out of things that the federal government doesn't need to be involved in. So for Milton Friedman, a way to think about education reform was vouchers and things like this. And I think there's a lot that we could still learn from Milton Friedman, certainly about the size of the government relative to what you talked about, which is just thinking about free enterprise. And that was a term that we used a lot, I think. In the 80s, it was certainly a big term that we used during the Reagan administration. And to me, I think what that means, and I think what Buckley viewed it as being, is the freedom to try. It's not equality of outcome, it's not equality of income, it's about the freedom to give it a shot, and that this is part of the American dream.
It's this idea of equal rights, but not equal things.
Right.
And you not only get to try, but you get to try again and again. And that's what we see with so many of our famous entrepreneurs and people that are changing the world and making our lives more convenient. And I don't really know if Friedman just brought Buckley's ideas to life in such an easy to understand format, because some of the other folks that he had, I mean, Thomas Sowell came out of that audience with Friedman. You can still see him. I think he was the student at University of Chicago, was not yet converted. And then other guys like Frederick Hayek and The Road to Serfdom. And those are some things that we have real opportunity for today, is to find those young students that can go into the Lion's Den, tough places like Phil Donahue's show, which was very much like The View of today, and win the audience over.
Yes. I do think that's what they had in common. So it must have been something that was aligned them based on their personalities. I think Milton Friedman was sharp. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize, just unmatched intellect, but he was witty and charming and did not leave his ideas in the ivory tower. Like you said, he went on Donahue, he was on firing line. He in fact encouraged academics that we should speak to the public. We shouldn't just speak to each other. And he was fighting about issues that were so important to the future of America. As you mentioned, they still are today. So I really think that willingness to say that these are really challenging intellectual ideas, but let's put them on the table and talk about them on a talk show.
My friend Bill Lee, who's the governor of Tennessee, likes to say, I'm a conservative. I'm just not angry about it. And you really saw this with Buckley, with Milton Friedman. They were subject matter experts, but they also loved life.
Yes.
And they wanted to go into these settings, not where it was set up for them, but they loved the ability to ask the questions, give the examples, and bring the public along. And when we talk about conservative leaders, we of course saw that in Goldwater out of Arizona, and then Reagan writ large, and many replicate fadings since then. But those ideas are still winning ideas properly presented.
I think one of the primary intellectual influences for Buckley was Alfred J. Knock, who was, of course, a family friend and, found at the dinner table often. And he was kind of, I think, in some ways, we should be reading him. If Bill Buckley thought it was important, we should think it's important. But a profound intellectual influence in, he was more libertarian. He was anti-war. He was very worried about the state and the growth of the state and what that does to not just individualism, because I think that's a word that doesn't mean a lot to a lot of us, or maybe even has negative connotations, but just to the individual's ability to have agency over their lives, to get the most level of human flourishing that they can. And I think that's at the end of the day what we all want. That was a really important philosophical influence for Buckley on how do I, as a conservative, because I think he had those leanings very young based on his
Yes.
father and his family upbringing, but how do I think about what conservatism means in a changing 20th century when he's writing and growing up?
Yes, I think that relationship with Knock shows the breadth of relationships that he had, because of course Knock was libertine, but also I think atheist. So Buckley was able to take the ideas that he thought added value and also develop his own philosophy and his own beliefs that informed his life.
That's right. And certainly at that time, I mean, if you think about the time that he's coming of age, the world is really changing. It's the end of World War II, and this is a time when Nobel Prize winning economist F.A. Hayek would really start to advance his publications on kind of what he was worried about as we were kind of going out to rebuild Europe. And he just, I think, in many ways viewed his scholarship had to address not just socialism. He was certainly a big part of what we call the economic calculation debate and the efficacy of socialism, which certainly Bill Buckley was very influential to him because he was very much worried about communism, as we should still be today. It's certainly not kind of a dead idea. But F.A. Hayek really, I think, changed the economics profession. And that's really important for Buckley if you think about his time at Yale. So, when he writes God and Man at Yale, as a 25-year-old, by the way, right? This is actually so remarkable. He is critiquing the textbooks and the faculty that are teaching economics. So it's actually remarkable to me that he comes out of that just more empowered as a conservative who is dedicated to freedom and free people, because I think a lot of people go through that experience and they come out in the other, moved in the other direction, and that is exactly what he's worried about. So in this book, this 25-year-old who was an undergraduate major in economics takes on Paul Samuelson, who would later win the Nobel Prize, and everything he critiqued him for at the time was right then, and it's right now. So, I just am amazed when I think about the time that he was writing, and certainly the way the world was changing in the 1950s and the 1960s and up through the Cold War. Those voices for freedom, Hayek being an intellectual one, Friedman being an intellectual one, I think were really important to how he would think about what it means to advocate for free people, but also just developing this movement of conservatism.
In so many ways, Buckley was prescient because he knew so much of this before he went to Yale, and he saw these professors dissuading him from the values of his fathers and generations before. And I think that's how he connected his conservatism, was not only what we know from the past, but what's the best idea for today and what will benefit future generations. And that's why you can have this alignment of ideas over time, and so many politicians try to trade on the issue of the day for the quick fix, which is almost always going to be designed from them, from Washington, D.C., and be top down. And he knew how to reject that out of hand, but make the case for what was the better long-term idea.
That's right. So I think he was very committed to the principles, but how do the principles play out in politics? And he understood the machinations of politics. I actually think he was brilliant for never, really, kind of, I think a lot of people, Reagan, Nixon, wanted him involved, and he said, this is the way that I can
almost mayor of New York.
Yeah, that's right. What was it, 13%, which is really remarkable.
Made a point.
But he made a point, and I think at the end of the day, I mean, I didn't know him, but this is what he was doing it for, to advance the ideas, to speak to ordinary Americans who he knew, I think, had a deep commitment in our history to freedom, and that this could be co-opted by the state and eviscerated by the state. And so I think he's fighting a culture war. He's fighting it intellectually, he's doing it in a principled way. He's less worried about the politics per se and more worried about helping us think through the policies of the day.
Part of the reason I think this discussion around economic freedom and free enterprise is so important goes back to the quote that Buckley said about the problem with capitalism is capitalism. It creates so much that there are sure to be disparities. And we hear this a lot today about income inequality. But the solution to this from the other side is this leveling, this cutting down all the tall trees. And we know, one, that socialism doesn't work. It's been tried, and you don't have to go back and read Modern Times to know this. We've seen this throughout Western Europe, and it's caused so many of the conflicts and deaths of the 20th century. But this idea of also making sure people understand what free enterprise can mean to them personally, but what it provides our country and our people is something that Buckley was able to weave through all of his arguments.
I think one of the things that he did well was he got down to the core of human nature. You mentioned Adam Smith earlier, and I think this is what actually makes Adam Smith a great economist, though he was a moral philosopher, is that he understood the human condition. So the problem with capitalism is capitalism. The problem with socialism is socialism. To me, is a commentary on the human condition. And that we are always and everywhere dealing with flawed, fallen human beings who have a propensity to greed, but we also have a propensity to innovation, to creating amazing things, and to cultivating more human flourishing. So he was a realist about these institutions. The common denominator of all these institutions are human beings. And so the question then becomes, relative to all those economic systems, socialism and capitalism, which one is going to best uphold the dignity of the individual and allow us to experience the good life? I think that's what he was about. And I think he really understood the dangers of socialism. To your point, socialism is always wrapped up in really, really nice packaging, isn't it? It never promises a breadline, it never promises a famine, it never promises any of those things that are always the realities of socialism. But he was remarkable in his just ability to bring us back over and over and over again to that while socialism may sound good on paper, it can't accomplish its goals. And it leads to these immiserating unintended consequences. And he just so fervently believed that I think that he really helped us understand it's not about picking the perfect system. My professor in graduate school, Peter Bettke, used to say all the time to us as econ students, economics puts constraints on your utopias. And I absolutely believe that Buckley understood that it's not about getting perfect. It's about getting the best that we can have so that we can get the most out of life.
Yes, he absolutely understood that. And I think the real difference between him and those that promoted socialism is that he did understand human nature. And really, this goes back to some of his religious beliefs, but it's also true in economics, the fallen nature of man, and that's why incentives for good behavior, for following the law, are so important, versus thinking that you can have a perfectibility of a human or someone that's all-knowing in charge. It's the beauty of our structure is our government is so diffuse. There's really become an imperial presidency as of late, and we love to have these arguments on who's going to be the next king and will they be elected by the right party. But the idea is we've had our share of excellent leaders, but we've also had a lot of mediocrity over 250 years. But the nation has thrived, and that's been on the people, not the government.
And I think it goes to a saying, there's a little bit of socialism, even not perfect socialism, but a little bit of socialism leads to lots of poverty and human immiseration, and a little bit of capitalism leads to enormous economic growth. And I think he understood that. He understood that, how ordinary Americans want to live their lives is in accordance for most people with kind of what he viewed as conservative principles. And so again, speaking practically, but backed by deep commitment and philosophical astuteness, I don't know how else to say it, he just really understood the argument he was making and was unwavering in that argument. But I think the other thing that we're missing today, because it seems to me that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, maybe we Americans got a little lazy. It's possible that we thought, okay, freedom has won the day, we've won the battle against the communists, we can kind of go do other things. And you look, now we're well into the 21st century, and we see that is certainly not true at all, not even domestically for us. We have American politicians running as quote unquote democratic socialists, right? And so the fight for freedom is endless. And the only thing that helps us speak into that are the timeless principles that he just so deeply understood.
And part of Buckley's creation was Ronald Reagan, and he talked about that price for freedom is fought with every generation. And I do think there were a lot of smart people in 1989. The wall falls, talking about the peace dividend, the end of history, democracy, freedom, free enterprise has won the day. Well, that's not the case. And I don't know that that will ever be the case, because you have to continually make the case for that. And so many incredible things that our country has shown the world, and of course our values, but the export that we can point to that proves the case more than any other is free enterprise. It has lifted more people out of misery and poverty, and it does bring peace and prosperity, but there's other things that you have to surround that with. But those things may have happened with Adam Smith, and I always thought it was ironic that that book was published in 1776.
Yes, a big year all around.
All around, a very good year.
Yes.
But those are things that need to be continually communicated, and young people need to understand and be educated on that.
One element of Buckley's approach, and I think it gets to who he was as a person, known as just compassionate and friendly and charming, is that he made relationships with people that he disagreed with. John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a leading left, kind of socialist economist, Keynesian, he made friends, he invited them onto the show, he engaged them in dialogue, and he's known on Firing Line, if you watch the episodes, is that he gives people a lot of time to explain themselves. So he's not rushing to cut you off. So his agenda wasn't, I'm going to invite you on my show to show you that I'm right and you're wrong, even though we disagree. But it's that I believe that discourse is the way we persuade. And so I cannot possibly do that if I don't bring in people who stand for the opposite of what my economic policies are, like Galbraith. Bigger government is the solution, more government intervention in the economy to kind of fix booms and busts and all this talk that was going on at the time, which certainly is still the talk of today. And I think it's fearlessness. I think if you surround yourself only with your friends, you're never going to convince anybody, and this is not what he was about. If they trust you and they view you as a friend, they view you as charming, which he was, then they're actually more open to listening to you.
It's what makes Buckley so special, because these people were his friends. He was not just pals with folks that were in alignment with him or that could come and advocate on the show. I love the stories he would have in some of his books and writings and conversations of the dinner parties he would host at his home with folks from around New York City or Washington, D.C., and often assembled the table so that many of the people there didn't agree, but they enjoyed the evening. They had great conversation, and Bill's show was a show that people watched, It was a safe place from a civil perspective, but you know that he was going to have his time and respond after you had a fair hearing. And that's dramatically different than much of our politics today. And hopefully we can find a way back into this idea of debate and discussion and let the best idea win.
Yes, and I think that's also a great example for the next generation. I think students should embrace that idea of hospitality and get together on campus, and we should be inviting people that might disagree with us, that might come from different political parties or ideological affiliations, and say, you're welcome, let's talk about it, let's keep it civil. This is exactly what higher education is for. And I think social media, I mean, this is, kind of the way in one primary way that we communicate with one another today, which didn't exist but for not too long ago. And so I think that it can be a great tool for us to get information, to learn things, but I also think that it can allow us to do what Buckley didn't want us to do, which is to vilify people, which was to cut them off, which actually I think social media allows you to cheaply kind of be mean and start fights because you're kind of hidden behind the screen. And I think he would encourage us to just have in-person, open, civil debates. I love the idea. Bring your, kind of the people that you disagree with to the dinner table. And again, I think that stems to his love of people.
I think you and I both think when you have bad speech, the way to remedy it is with more speech. Yet today we have more speech than we've ever had with the invention of the internet and social media. But it is that blocking of people, unfollowing folks, or not engaging in the discussion that I think has politics so tribal. And I know there's been studies done, if they take some of these people who are the social media warriors and bring them around a table in a safe setting where they feel they can have conversation, it's dramatically different. And we have to find a way to get back and keep that as we go forward, because we're only going to have more innovations into how we can share our opinions, our ideas, and hopefully find the way forward.
Agree, and I think another lesson we can pull from Buckley's example and just the way he pursued debate and discussion via writing but also conversation is that he was really interested in the long game. He was really interested in the big existential fight for freedom. It wasn't just about this bill that's going to pass tomorrow or who's going to be president next. He thought all that was important, but I think he was fighting a long, big game that he understood had huge consequences. I think our obsession with social media gets us so focused on what's happening today, right now. That's the most important and pressing issue. And so I think from his example, we can say, what does it look like to kind of think about the long horizon in the way we formulate our ideas, but also in the way we carry ourselves with our adversaries intellectually, that is.
Yes. I don't recall early on going to college people identifying themselves by their political party. We would have these college dorm room bull sessions, and somebody there would be more passionate about an idea than someone else, and you'd have this back and forth. And then I came of age in the 80s. It allowed me to land on conservatism because that's where my values and thoughts and the principles aligned. And in many ways, I always think it's so interesting that somebody like Ronald Reagan could be considered too extreme for the nomination in 1976, wins re-election in 1984 with 49 states. And he's called the great communicator for a reason. He was able to communicate these principles that we're talking about in a timeless way. And I think there's a real opportunity for that to happen going forward.
I couldn't agree more. And it's important not to say, I'm going to just surround myself with people I agree with. And you're right. I don't think this was always the way of doing it, but maybe yours and my experience were different because of Buckley's approach. I think he was civilizing. He believed in civilized debate. He believed in giving people time to speak their opinions. And he wasn't afraid of those opinions. And he, as you said, reserved the right to say, well, I disagree with you and here's why. But I think he understood the value in that. And so today, I think college students, certainly in my classroom, I am absolutely encouraging of them to say, this is a place where we read about ideas. You may never have heard them before. You may disagree with some of the economics. Let's talk it through. And the classroom is the place to do that. I think he understood that well.
And isn't that the idea, the search for truth?
Yes.
and what's real. And I think this idea, you know, I invoke Reagan. I have 3 young sons. Well, they know Ronald Reagan as well as they know George Washington. And I think Buckley could fall into the same category. But think of the simple things that he did, just bringing people together, breaking bread, opening up some beverages that everyone would enjoy, and then having this social set, this network across party lines, where he maintained it through grand victories and bitter defeats.
Yes. As we were saying before, Buckley was not just focused on what's happening today in the news, what's happening today in presidential or other politics, but he's thinking about the long battle to preserve freedom. As you said, he knows Reagan as well as George Washington. I think that's such a great example. And so he wants the next generation to have this appreciation and to have a place where they can come talk about these ideas. So he starts to engage in building these institutions that are thinking about not just even the young people of his own generation, but of course he's trying to build lasting institutions, which he did. He starts the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. He starts the Philadelphia Society, Young Americans Foundation, and the place where I work, the Fund for American Studies. And so all of these organizations are really focused on young people, and not just young academics. It's not just people who want to go into politics. It's really thinking about picking out people who are engaged and thoughtful and excited about ideas, but want to learn more.
Yes, and these really are his legacy, because these institutions still exist today.
Yes.
People can go become a part of them, but they can also do things like open up a Milton Friedman Club, which I understand is operating on numerous college campuses, and what Robbie George is doing at Princeton. And you're seeing these little schools of not only conservative economics, but the great books and the great thinkers. And you can major in that if you like, but you certainly should take some courses there. That's part of a great liberal arts education. And it's fine to get a business degree or an engineering degree, but you should come out with some of that education of how we got to where we are. And so many of the ideas that we're going to want to discuss and continue to discuss in the political debate.
That's right. And I think these institutions are so important then and today because they provide a space for people who are, even if you're not kind of fully committed to being a conservative when you're 20, which is reasonable, right? A lot of people and students are still figuring it out. But it's a space where these ideas can be presented and discussed. And so when you go to the Philadelphia Society today, right, we're talking about what does it mean to be a conservative? We're doing that in the 21st century. And I think Bill Buckley was asking that question as a 25-year-old and didn't stop asking it. And so these institutions are need to be preserved and protected. I think we need to find even more ways. You mentioned the Milton Friedman clubs, which I just recently learned about this, and it's very exciting to me as an economist that there's people that are sitting around on a college campus talking about Milton Friedman's ideas. I think we need more of this. And I think, again, that's what higher education is for, is the freedom to ask, pursue, and pursue truth.
And one of the things that's great about these institutions is oftentimes college can be such a big place. And it's part of how you learn and become more resourceful. But to find these small cohorts that will make it smaller, meet new people, be introduced to different ideas is really how you round that education out and maximize it.
Agree, and I think it also, whether you're an academic or a professional, well into their career, attending Philadelphia Society meetings, or you're a young college student going to the Fund for American Studies or the Young Americans Foundation to do an internship program or a summer program, I think that it's really important to have opportunities to kind of delve further. And I think Buckley, because of the time that he, again, came of age, there was no space for conservatives. There were no conservative organizations and institutions. And so I think conservatives felt lonely. And there was nobody with whom they could debate these ideas. And they were all reading alone rather than kind of coming together. And so I think that's part of his legacy, is how to bring people together. And these lasting institutions, I think, are so important.
Yes, his level of energy was unmatched. He was tireless in this pursuit, and he weaved it through everything that he did in his life. It had to be really exciting for Buckley to found National Review, define American conservatism, suffer a bitter defeat with Barry Goldwater, but to see all these ideas come to life successfully with Ronald Reagan, and such a component of that was supply side economics. And I think in many ways we see these different leaders over the decades claiming their economy. In so many ways, it's Reagan's economy that we have built on, and we've understood that lower taxes and lighter regulation and the idea of production of the individual and the entrepreneur to try and try again has transformed the nation economically and financially.
I think that's right. And, when you think about that movement, supply side economics, I think what needs to be the lesson or the takeaway from that, young college students weren't even alive when these debates were happening, but I think they're still so important for us to understand, which is that economic growth and economic development come from rising levels of productivity. By the way, this goes all the way back to Adam Smith.
Yes.
Right? He understood that it was specialization in the division of labor, and that these things were fostered by increasing circles, or he would say widening circles of exchange. So there's just such a long intellectual legacy that gets you there. But I think the idea is that we need to live in a society where ordinary people that don't have to be a member of the political class, they don't have to be born into a certain family, they can be entrepreneurs. And so I think for Buckley, for Reagan, this idea or this phrase of free enterprise is really important to this idea of supply side economics, because the idea is that you want an economy where you have so many businesses opening. Why can businesses open? Because people have capital and they can invest that capital in a business that serves customers. You can't do that if you're just trying to make it through the day. If you live in immiserating poverty, you can't do this. Again, Buckley and Reagan strongly anti-communist and anti-socialist, because they understood that this erodes the fabric of innovation and therefore destroys economic growth. So this is so important. We need to live in a society where the economic system fosters entrepreneurship, the unleashing of human capital for the betterment of all of us. And so I think Reagan and Buckley would be against, it's not a pro-business or a pro-big business per se point of view. It's a pro-opportunity society, maybe is how I'd put it.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. It's a special favors for none,
yes,
but opportunity for all. That's the beauty of economic freedom, and that's where the miracle ideas come from that we can point to with these heroic entrepreneurs. But it's also the shopkeepers,
yes,
the people that make their living in different specialties and have not only carved out a good life for themselves financially, but have the freedom to raise their children and send their kids to a school that they're proud of and reinforces the values that they have at home and gives them the confidence also to retire. I mean, this is something that's rather new in human history,
yes,
that you can live to a certain point in time and then take the last third of your life and enjoy it. And it's also what's allowed us to do some of the things that support our social safety net. For our friends on the left, we would never be able to create that without the wealth creation and prosperity and excess we have in this country. It's also allowed us to overcome a lot of the bad spending and budget decisions out of Washington, D.C. Someday somebody's going to have to deal with that, but to date, we've been able to grow this economy, and like you said, it's been productivity and innovation.
And I think Buckley understood and spoke about the negative, harmful effects of over-regulating business and over-regulating the economy, that this actually retards economic development and growth. So if you have such cumbersome and burdensome regulations in cities, in states, from the federal government even, you're actually destroying that opportunity society. Because I think there's actually a really important egalitarian notion to this,
yes,
which is if you're wealthy, you can just kind of pay people to figure it out, you can hire a lawyer, you can work around the system. But if you're, kind of middle class or coming from the bottom of the income distribution, you have an idea that you want to open a small business. We want people to be able to do that because that's what gives them that income mobility. And he saw that, Reagan saw that as essential to what we talk about as the American dream, right? It's the being able to, maybe you start at the bottom of the income distribution, but you don't have to stay there. That's really important. But the government can't crush businesses and entrepreneurship and firms. And so I think that's ultimately what supply side economics is about, which is antithetical to Keynesianism. Kind of Keynes talked about the animal spirits in business. So he didn't trust. He wanted a large government to be the corrective when anything went wrong. And I think this takes us again back to why Buckley and also Reagan were influenced by these economic ideas. They understood that the government it's not made of divine beings.
Yes.
And so they can't there's nothing magic about them solving the problem. They just have the monopoly of force. I think Knock called it the monopoly of crime. I mean, there's just no other more blatant way that you can put it. And so again, I think the government has a purpose, and Bill Buckley understood that purpose, but he wanted to make sure it stayed constrained so you get that thriving economy.
Yes, and change is not always reform or improvement. We're 250 years in or nearly to this experiment, and so much of this cronyism and special interest protection has crept in. And it's hard to point to any flaws that the founders had in the construction of these documents. But I don't think they could have ever imagined the proliferation of laws and regulation that would ever come from elected leaders. It would be nice, I always thought, if we were to have some type of sunset clause on these laws and regulations. If it's a good law, let the existing legislature or the then current legislature repass it. But if it's a law that we're getting unintended consequences from, or that we can expose to just protecting a special interest, let it go away.
That's right. And I think Buckley understood. You read him and you see sometimes he says the best thing the government can do is stop doing what it's doing. It's to your point, it's not always going in and creating some new program, but rather if this is limiting economic growth, if this is harming ordinary citizens from starting businesses, let's just stop. And actually on paper that's fairly easy. In politics it's not easy, but to stop doing something is much easier than to craft a new program to do something.
Well, it's like supply side economics. Incentives matter.
Incentives matter.
And when you do this in politics, it's rather unpopular because you're irritating the special interests, the lobbyists who sit on so many of these boards, and you're removing things. There's no celebration or applause in the press, but it is good public service.
Yes.
I have such a passion for this because my company was Cold Stone Creamery, the ice cream brand. We started with one store in Tempe, Arizona, and grew it to 1,440 stores in all 50 states. Today it operates in 31 countries around the world. And when you're an ice cream store, you are the little guy. I mean, anybody that's opened up a lemonade stand understands an ice cream store. So we couldn't hire a lobbyist or a lawyer for these regulations. The business had to work for the entry-level franchisee, and franchising is very much a Ray Kroc American innovation that allows people to go into business for themselves but not by themselves. And it was in many ways a great primer on becoming a governor. I understood economic policy and the things that stood in the way and the things that could be removed more often than not that allowed human flourishing and allowed more participation in the market and the creation of more prosperity for people. And I was involved in Arizona in the Goldwater Institute, which is our conservative think tank. And before I had run for office or even contemplated it seriously, Bill Buckley came to speak. And he always packed the room, and it was entertaining and charming. And we were both waiting for our car at valet afterwards at the Biltmore, and I went up and introduced myself, and he couldn't have been more kind and accessible, and it was a little bit of a wait, so I heard some great stories about the founding of National Review, and we know so many of the writers that have come from there. There are many of the folks now that we see as talking heads or out and about beating the drum for the cause, but it really did start as an idea.
Yes.
And the other thing that I really want to applaud him for is he was able to build the conservative movement and keep the voices of conspiracy and that would have never allowed it to thrive and prosper and become a majority movement out. And we're missing that in many ways where there are gatekeepers. Of course, we want to have the politics of addition and, when done properly, multiplication, but we certainly don't want people buying into conspiracy and things that can really get in our own way.
Agree. I think we just owe him a huge debt.
Yes.
Especially, I think, we're younger, or we're older than the college students maybe who are watching this, but where would we be without these institutions? Where would we be without his idea to start National Review? Where would we be without Firing Line? I think we'd be in a very different place, and so it was a Herculean effort, and he was just, what do they say, they cracked the mold, God cracked the mold, right? Just a different...
One of a kind.
One of a kind, and he was a gift to the world, I guess is the way I would put it, just remarkable.
Amen.